At 63, Jon Bon Jovi, the man whose voice once defined the sound of an entire generation, has finally broken his silence. For decades, the world knew him as the face of resilience, the eternal rock icon who turned heartbreak into anthems. But behind the stadium lights and platinum records, there was a secret, a wound that never truly healed. Recently, Jon revealed the one story he had kept buried for years, a story of love, betrayal, and friendship torn apart. It involved two names that few ever expected to hear in the same breath, Diane Lane and Richie Sambora. Fans who grew up idolizing Bon Jovi were stunned. How could one of the most respected partnerships in rock history, the bond between Jon and Richie, be scarred by something so personal, so human? Jon's confession peeled back the curtain on a world where fame could not protect the heart, where trust, once broken, left the scars deeper than any lyric could describe. But why now? Why, after decades of silence, did Jon finally decide to speak? Was it revenge, closure, or something far more painful, the need to be understood? This revelation shook the foundations of what people thought they knew about him. And as Jon spoke, it became clear this wasn't about gossip, it was about the cost of loyalty. When love crosses the wrong line, long before the headlines, before the whispers and the betrayal, there was admiration. Jon Bon Jovi, the charismatic frontman of one of the biggest rock bands on earth, met Diane Lane, the Hollywood actress whose elegance could light up any room. Their worlds collided through the unpredictable rhythm of fame. He was the voice of a generation, she, the face of timeless grace. Rumors of their connection had swirled for years, but both remained a silence that spoke louder than any confession. Though neither ever publicly confirmed a romantic relationship, their chemistry was undeniable. They were often seen at the same events, sharing glances that fans and reporters couldn't help but notice. The kind of glances that say more than words ever could. Diane's charm and emotional depth seemed to match Jon's intensity. Two souls who understood what it meant to live under constant scrutiny. Their connection, born in the glitter of fame, carried an air of tenderness and danger. For a time, their bond seemed built on respect and shared understanding, but beneath that calm surface, tension brewed. As Jon would later admit, trust was broken, and the betrayal changed everything. It wasn't just about love, it was about loyalty. The pain wasn't public, but it was personal. And as Jon finally spoke out decades later, the weight of that betrayal could still be heard in his voice. Diane Lane, known for her poise and dignity, became the center of speculation once again. This time, not as an actress, but as a pivotal figure in Jon's emotional storm. And behind the scenes, another name began to surface, a name that turned this private heartbreak into something much more complicated, Richie Sambora. Because the next part of this story isn't about romance, it's about friendship and the ultimate betrayal that tore two brothers apart. To understand the magnitude of Jon Bon Jovi's pain, you have to understand what Richie Sambora meant to him. They weren't just bandmates, they were brothers. Together, they conquered the world, crafting songs that defined a generation. Living on a prayer, wanted dead or alive, always. Those weren't just hits. They were stories of their lives, born from trust, brotherhood, and creative fire. For decades, Jon and Richie stood side by side, surviving fame's chaos and the crushing weight of expectation. But behind the music, another story was unfolding. one that would threaten to destroy everything they built together. According to Jon's revelation, Richie and Diane Lane shared something far deeper than friendship. It was a connection that broke the unspoken code between two men who had lived, worked, and dreamed together. When Jon found out, it wasn't anger that hit first, it was disbelief. The man he had trusted most, the partner who had stood with him on every stage, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Fans had always sensed there was tension long before Richie left the band in 2013. Back then, the official story spoke of homocreative differences and personal reasons. But now, with Jon's words, everything took on a new meaning. The wounds ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just the breakup of a friendship. It was the end of a bond forged in years of loyalty and sacrifice. It made the music sound different, the lyrics heavier, the silences between them louder. And while Richie Sambora has chosen to remain quiet, his silence only fuels the mystery. Some say it's guilt, others believe it's dignity. But for Jon, it was a silence that screamed louder than any apology could. The betrayal by a friend often hurts more than one from a lover, because when a brother betrays you, there's no song, no lyric, no melody in the world that can make it right again. And yet, even amid the heartbreak, the world wanted to know, how did the public react when the truth finally came out? The answer reveals just how fragile fame can truly be. When Jon Bon Jovi's revelation finally reached the public, it was like a thunderclap. Headlines erupted across tabloids, entertainment sites, and social media feeds. Fans around the world, those who had grown up idolizing the brotherhood between Jon and Richie, were left stunned, torn between sympathy and disbelief. This wasn't just another celebrity scandal, it was a real human story about trust, betrayal, and the cracks that fame can't hide. For some, Jon's honesty was seen as brave, a man finally freeing himself from the weight of decades of silence. They admired his vulnerability, his willingness to expose the pain behind the image of an untouchable rock god. Others, however, questioned the timing. Was this confession a form of healing, or reopening old wounds for the world to see? Meanwhile, Diane Lane's name, once synonymous with grace and quiet dignity, found itself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. The media tread carefully, knowing that Lane had always guarded her private life with fierce discretion. She never courted controversy, never sought attention, yet here she was, pulled back into a story she had never publicly told. Reporters scoured old interviews and appearances, searching for clues, moments when the tension between Jon, Diane, and Richie might have silently played out in front of the cameras. Fan forums turned into investigative archives filled with speculation, theories, and emotional debates. Supporters of Jon empathized deeply, saying his openness reflected the pain many experience when betrayed by those closest to them. Others warned that no one truly knows the full story, that behind every revelation lies another side, still untold. But through it all, one truth became clear. Even for those who live in the spotlight, heartbreak remains profoundly human. Fame may magnify the pain, but it never makes it easier to bear. Jon's story transcended gossip. It became a mirror for everyone who had ever been betrayed, who had ever lost a friend to silence, or a love to trust broken in secret. And as the world reacted, attention shifted toward the past. The whispers, the unspoken rumors that had surrounded Jon, Diane, and Richie for years before this confession ever came to light. Because what Jon revealed wasn't entirely new. The signs had been there, hidden in plain sight. Long before Jon Bon Jovi chose to speak, the air around him had always been heavy with whispers, backstage talk, uncomfortable silences, subtle changes in body language between him and Richie Sambora. To fans, it was barely noticeable, but to those close to the band, something had been off for years. Rumors had begun to swirl quietly in the early 2010s, long before Richie left the band in 2013. The official explanation spoke of creative differences and personal struggles, but insiders whispered about a private betrayal, one that cut far deeper than professional disagreements. And then there was Diane Lane. Unlike many Hollywood stars, Diane had always maintained her privacy. She avoided drama, shunned gossip, and rarely gave the media anything personal. Yet, from time to time, her name would appear in the faintest of tabloid lines, often connected to Jon or Richie. There were the fleeting glances at award shows, the polite but distant smiles, and the sudden absences from certain public events. Each small detail fueled the speculation that behind the polished smiles of fame, something much more fragile was breaking. Jon's confession, years later, turned those old rumors into revelations. It made fans revisit interviews, photos, and performances, suddenly seeing what they had missed before. That tension between Jon and Richie during their last few tours wasn't just exhaustion, it was personal. In hindsight, even some of Jon's songs carried echoes of heartbreak that now made perfect sense. Lyrics about lost trust, silent suffering, and brotherhood betrayed. They weren't just metaphors anymore. They were confessions in plain sight. The truth, once revealed, reshaped everything: the music, the friendship, the legacy. Even Jon's silence all those years became a symbol, not of denial, but of endurance. Because sometimes pain doesn't explode in public. It lingers quietly, buried under the spotlight, until one day it demands to be heard. And when it finally is, it changes everything. But perhaps the most unexpected impact of all wasn't on Jon's personal life. It was on his music, his art, and the evolution of the man himself. For Jon Bon Jovi, music has always been more than fame. It's been therapy. Every lyric, every melody, every haunting guitar riff was a piece of his soul translated into sound, and after the heartbreak involving Diane Lane and Richie Sambora, that music changed. When Richie left the band in 2013, fans assumed it was simply creative exhaustion, two artists drifting apart. But behind the curtain, the real reason was heartbreak layered with betrayal. Their brotherhood had been fractured in a way no reunion tour could ever fix. In the years that followed, Jon's songwriting took on a new tone, darker, more introspective. The anthems of youthful rebellion gave way to reflections on pain, loyalty, and forgiveness. Songs like Because We Can and Limitless felt like they came from a man searching for balance between a strength and sorrow. Critics called it maturity, but for Jon, it was survival. He channeled the ache of betrayal into purpose. His music stopped being about arenas and applause and became about endurance, integrity, and the human struggle to stay kind after being hurt. Even in interviews, Jon's voice changed. There was a weight behind his words, a quiet sadness beneath the smile. He didn't speak in bitterness, but with the wisdom of someone who had walked through fire and learned to live with the scars. Not everything can be fixed, he once said, but everything can teach you something. Those words defined his later career, and though he may never again share a stage with Richie Sambora, The music they made together remains a testament to a time when friendship and art were one and the same before life got in the way. For Jon, this public revelation wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming truth. After decades of silence, he chose honesty, not to destroy, but to heal. Because sometimes the greatest act of a strength isn't holding the pain in, it's finally letting it out. And through that courage, Jon Bon Jovi reminded the world of something powerful. Even legends bleed, even icons break, but the greatest ones, they turn their pain into legacy. When Jon Bon Jovi finally broke his silence, the world waited, breath held, for Diane Lane and Richie Sambora to respond. But what came next was silence. Diane Lane, always known for her quiet strength and elegance, chose not to engage. She made no public statements, gave no interviews, and issued no denials. For some, her silence was a shield, a dignified refusal to let private pain become public theater. For others, it spoke volumes, a wordless acknowledgement of a truth too complicated to explain. Richie Sambora, too, stayed quiet. The man who once harmonized beside Jon on stage, who shared laughter, sweat, and years of brotherhood, now avoided the subject entirely. He focused on his daughter, on his solo music, on rebuilding peace in his own way. Reporters pressed for comments, but both Richie's and Diane's representatives simply replied with phrases like "no comment" or "respecting privacy." In Hollywood, such restraint is rare, and yet perhaps it was the only way to bring calm to a storm that had already done enough damage. Jon, for his part, didn't lash out. He spoke carefully, his tone reflective rather than accusatory. His revelation wasn't an attack, it was a release. He wasn't asking for pity, he was asking to be understood. And that distinction changed everything, because in the end, the real story wasn't about scandal, it was about humanity. 3 lives intertwined by love, friendship, and fame, now bound by something deeper, the courage to move on without hate. Commentators praised Jon's honesty, calling it grace under fire. They noted that Diane's and Richie's silence, while mysterious, showed restraint, a rare act of self-control in an age where everyone feels the need to explain themselves online. Behind that silence lay something powerful: acceptance, an unspoken understanding that not every wound deserves another battle. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is say nothing at all. And from that silence came peace. But what Jon did next, beyond the confessions and the chaos, revealed is something far more inspiring. Because out of heartbreak, he found something stronger than forgiveness: resilience. When the noise faded and the world moved on to its next scandal, Jon Bon Jovi stood quietly, not broken, but reborn. He had faced the kind of pain that fame can't soften and money can't fix. And yet, out of betrayal, he found something priceless: clarity. For decades, Jon had lived as the rock icon who could do no wrong, the symbol of cool confidence, loyalty, and endurance. But this revelation stripped away the myth and revealed the man underneath, vulnerable, bruised, and deeply human. And that honesty became his redemption. Rather than let heartbreak define him, Jon turned it into purpose. He poured his pain into his music, into his charity work, into the relationships that still mattered. He began writing from a deeper place, not to entertain, but to connect. Every lyric became a bridge between his struggle and the struggles of millions who had loved and lost just like him. He once said in an interview, "You can't build walls around your heart forever. If you do, you stop feeling, And when you stop feeling, you stop living. That truth became the soul of his later years. John's resilience wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about facing the hurt, forgiving those who couldn't apologize, and still finding a reason to keep singing. He showed the world that even legends fall, but the measure of greatness isn't in how high you climb, it's in how gracefully you rise after you've been brought to your knees. Fans who once saw him only as a rock star now saw him as something more. A survivor, a man who'd learned that fame is fleeting, but integrity lasts forever. And as the years passed, Jon Bon Jovi's story evolved from one of heartbreak to one of healing. He didn't erase the past, he embraced it, because every scar, every silence, every broken bond had shaped the man he became. His legacy isn't just built on #1 hits or sold-out tours. It's built on the courage to be real, to show that even those who seem larger than life still bleed, still love, still forgive. And maybe that's why his story matters more now than ever, because in a world obsessed with perfection, Jon Bon Jovi reminds us that the most powerful kind of a strength is the kind that comes from being human. As the years pass, Jon Bon Jovi's revelation remains more than a fleeting headline. It has become part of his legacy, not because of the scandal it exposed, but because of the truth it revealed about who he really is. He was never just the man with the golden voice or the flawless smile. He was, and still is, a fighter. A man who learned that the strength isn't born from perfection, but from pain endured quietly in the dark. His story, the love lost, the friendship shattered, the courage to speak, serves as a mirror for all who have walked through heartbreak and found their way back. He didn't emerge untouched, but he emerged wiser. He didn't seek revenge, only release. And perhaps that's why, even now, his fans love him more than ever. Because Jon Bon Jovi didn't just sing about life, he lived every lyric. From It's My Life to Always, from the anthems of defiance to the ballads of regret. Every word feels heavier now, more real. When he stood before the world and told his truth, it wasn't to reopen wounds. It was to remind everyone that even the brightest stars carry shadows, that love can fail, friendships can break, but what defines us is how we choose to move forward. Diane Lane's grace, Richie Sambora's silence, and John's courage, together they form a bittersweet melody about the fragility of trust and the resilience of the human heart. Because behind the fame, behind the flashing lights and platinum records, there were only people, flawed, fragile, and desperately searching for meaning, just like the rest of us. And in the end, John's greatest song was never on an album. It was his own story, one of heartbreak, forgiveness, and the quiet power of telling the truth. He may have broken his silence, but in doing so, Jon Bon Jovi found something far greater: peace.